Imagine this. You buy a beautiful piece of property near a peaceful lake. You've dreamed of mornings by the water, fishing, kayaking, maybe just relaxing with a coffee. It's not just a dream either. You paid extra for this. The deed to your property clearly states you have legal access to the lake. You saw it, you confirmed it, you even walked the little path that leads down to the shoreline when you first visited. Everything was perfect. Until it wasn't. One morning, you show up like always, ready to enjoy your weekend. You head toward the usual trail, maybe with a fishing rod or paddleboard in hand, and then you stop dead in your tracks. There's a fence. Not just any fence. A tall, locked, metal fence with a sign that says, "Private property. No entry without HOA permission." And just like that, your access is gone. No warning. No notice. Just a cold metal barrier between you and the water you were promised. You think, this must be a mistake. So, you reach out to the Homeowners Association, the HOA. You call. You email. You even attend a meeting. You explain that your deed includes lake access. It's written in black and white. But they don't care. Their answer? The gate was added for security. You'll need to request access on a case-by-case basis. Then they stop responding altogether. So now you're stuck. Your property says one thing, but your HOA is saying another. And the worst part? That little path, the one that connects everyone's lake rights to the water, sits on a tiny slice of land owned by a third party. A sliver of land that nobody thought twice about before. Except now, it's fenced, gated, and locked. It's a small gate. Nothing dramatic. But it's the only access point to the entire lakefront from this side. Everyone in your section of the neighborhood who thought they had lake rights? They don't. At least not unless someone opens that gate. And who has the key? Not you. Not the HOA. Not any of the property owners nearby. At first, you think, there must be a legal way to fix this. I'll just get a lawyer involved. Surely the HOA can't just block access that's written into the deed. But legal action takes time. And money. And a whole lot of stress. And meanwhile, summer is slipping by. The lake is right there, sparkling under the sun, but completely off limits. You can see it, but you can't touch it. Some neighbors shrug it off. Others are furious. A few suggest starting a petition or launching a lawsuit. But you start thinking differently. If access depends on that tiny slice of land, and that gate, why not control it? Not just complain about the fence or wait for someone else to take charge. Why not make a move no one sees coming? You do your homework. You dig into property records. You trace the ownership of that narrow strip of land with the gate. And what you find surprises you. It's privately owned. Not by the HOA. Not by the city. Just a quiet little lot. Almost forgotten. But it's for sale. No one else seems to know or care. But you see the opportunity for what it is. Because here's the thing. If the gate is the problem, then owning the gate might just be the solution. If the HOA wants to control access, and you buy the land under the gate, well, that changes everything. So, you make a decision. One that's bold. Risky. Maybe even a little crazy. But it's not about revenge. It's about principle. You bought your home with the belief that you had lake access. You didn't start this fight. But if standing up for your rights means owning the one piece of land that makes all the difference, then maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. And when the papers are signed, and the property is yours, something shifts. You now hold the only key to the gate. The very gate that the HOA used to block you, and everyone else, from the lake. Suddenly, the conversation changes. Because the HOA can't fence you out, if you own the fence. When all this started, it felt like a mistake. Something that would get fixed with a few emails, maybe a meeting or two. But the more I tried to get answers, the more I realized this wasn't just a mix-up. It was a deliberate move by the HOA. They knew what they were doing when they installed that fence. They knew it would cut off access. And they didn't care. I wasn't the only one affected. Several neighbors had the same deeded lake access. Most of us bought our homes under the same assumption, that we'd be able to walk down to the lake anytime we wanted. It was even used as a selling point. Private lake access for all homeowners. That line was in the brochures, the listings, even in conversations with real estate agents. But now, the HOA had put a stop to all of that. The fence wasn't just a simple boundary marker either. It was locked, reinforced, and clearly intended to keep people out. They installed it quickly, too. No warning, no community vote, no transparency. One day the path was open, the next day it was sealed shut. The only way to get past it was with a key. But the HOA wasn't handing those out. I requested access in writing, multiple times. Their response was vague and passive-aggressive. Due to ongoing safety concerns, lake access will be limited to approved events and monitored usage. When I asked who gets to approve these events, or who decides who gets in, silence. No follow-up. Just more excuses. At a community meeting, I brought it up again. Calmly. Respectfully. I pointed out that many of us had deeded rights. One of the board members looked annoyed. Another said something about maintaining order and liability issues. I asked, what liability? They mumbled something about insurance and quickly moved to the next agenda item. It was clear, they weren't interested in fixing this. They wanted control. That's when I started digging. I needed to understand exactly what my rights were and how far the HOA's authority actually went. I pulled up my property documents again and read every line. And there it was, clear as day. A legal easement to access the lake. A defined path that went right through the fenced area. It was written into the deed. Not as a suggestion, but as a legal right. So why wasn't it being honored? I called a property lawyer just to make sure I wasn't missing something. After reviewing the documents, they confirmed my suspicion. The HOA had no legal right to block that access. At least, not without renegotiating everyone's property rights, which they hadn't done. According to the lawyer, the HOA was overstepping. Big time. But here's the catch. Taking legal action would take months, maybe years. It would mean court dates, legal fees, and a drawn-out battle with a board that clearly didn't care about playing fair. And even if I won, what would the victory really look like? A grudging apology? A half-hearted promise to do better? No. I didn't want to fight just for the sake of it. I wanted a solution. A way to actually fix this without waiting forever. That's when I remembered something one of my neighbors mentioned, offhand, in frustration, about the narrow strip of land where the gate had been placed. It's not even HOA land, they said. They leased access years ago. That path cuts through private property. That little comment lit a spark. I started looking into the property records for that area. It took some time, but I finally found it. A tiny, odd-shaped lot, less than half an acre, wedged between the lake and our neighborhood. And the best part? It was still privately owned. Not by the HOA. Not by the city. Not by a neighbor. It had belonged to a local developer who had since moved on. The lot had sat untouched for years, just a leftover scrap of land from the original development. And it was for sale. Right there, on a quiet corner of a real estate listing site, was the key to everything. The same land the HOA had fenced. The same land they used to control lake access. For just a few $1,000s, it could be mine. It felt unreal. The gate they locked me out of? I could own it. The land under the path they tried to deny me? That could belong to me too. And with that ownership, the power dynamic would flip completely. No threats. No lawyers. No shouting matches at board meetings. Just one quiet transaction that would change everything. Buying that little strip of land felt strange at first. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't the kind of property you brag about. It was small, mostly unmaintained, with weeds growing through the fence posts and a narrow trail cutting across it. But to me, it was the most valuable piece of real estate I'd ever seen. It was the land that held the key, literally and legally, to the lake. The process to purchase it wasn't complicated. The owner hadn't done anything with the property in years. He was out of state, hadn't visited in a decade, and seemed almost surprised someone wanted to buy it. After a few emails, some paperwork, and a visit to the county office, the land was mine. Just like that. No competition, no bidding war, no resistance from the HOA, because they didn't even know it was for sale. They assumed they controlled it. But they never owned it. And with that one move, everything changed. The gate they used to lock everyone out? That was now on my land. The path that everyone had the legal right to use. That cut right through my property. The fence they installed without permission? It was technically trespassing. I didn't need to scream or file lawsuits. I didn't even need to argue. I just owned it. Quietly. Legally. Fully. The moment I received the official title, I went to the gate. Same one that had blocked me for months. Same one that sparked all this frustration. I stood there with the new key I had made, turned the lock, and opened it. That sound, the click of the lock opening, was the moment everything turned. I walked through. I stood by the lake. I didn't need anyone's permission now. No forms. No approvals. Just me and my rights, finally respected. But it didn't stop there. Word spread quickly. The HOA board found out within a few days. I'm sure they were confused at first. Then shocked. Then probably a little panicked. They had fenced off something they didn't own. They'd made rules about land that wasn't theirs. And now, the owner wasn't just any random person. It was the very homeowner they'd been pushing away. I got a call from one of the board members. Calm voice, trying to sound friendly. "Hey, we heard you bought that little lot near the lake. Just wanted to chat." I could almost hear the unease behind the words. They didn't know what I planned to do. They probably expected me to be angry. To block them out in return. To make things difficult. But I didn't want revenge. I wanted fairness. I just wanted what we were promised from the start. So I told them, yes, I own the property now. And I plan to honor the original deeded access for all the neighbors who have legal rights. But any structure on my land, including your fence, will need to be discussed. There was a long pause on the other end. And for once, they didn't have a ready answer. In the following weeks, things shifted. People who had been ignored at meetings suddenly had a voice again. The HOA sent out a notice about ongoing discussions regarding lake access. Their tone changed completely, from firm to cooperative. They asked if I'd be willing to meet and work out a solution. Meanwhile, neighbors started approaching me. People I barely knew before now stopped to talk. They thanked me. They shared their own frustrations with the board. Some even offered to help clean up the path or maintain the gate. What started as a quiet act of ownership began turning into something more, something that felt like a small, peaceful form of rebellion. And all of it came down to one simple fact. I paid attention when no one else did. While others accepted the fence, I followed the paperwork. While the board played power games, I played by the rules. And in the end, that was enough. It was never about being a hero or proving a point. It was about standing up when something wasn't right, and doing it in a way that couldn't be ignored. The response from the HOA wasn't immediate, but it came. At first, they sent me a polite letter, acknowledging the fact that I now owned the land. They mentioned they were reviewing the situation, and would get back to me soon. I could tell they were trying to be diplomatic, as if to avoid any kind of confrontation. They clearly hadn't expected anyone to challenge them, let alone win. But I wasn't in any rush. I had the land. I had the access. And for the first time in a long time, I had a feeling of control. I could go to the lake whenever I wanted. I could walk along the path without anyone questioning me. I could even invite neighbors who had the same rights and see the access they'd been denied for so long. Still, I knew this wasn't over. The HOA wasn't going to just roll over. They'd already shown they'd go to great lengths to hold onto their power. And I wasn't naive enough to think they wouldn't try to find a way to reassert control. I wasn't interested in dragging this out in a long, drawn-out conflict, but I also wasn't going to let them undermine my rights again. So, when they finally reached out for a meeting, I was ready. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't an argument. But it was clear they weren't used to being in the position of needing to negotiate. They thought they had all the cards. But now I was the one holding the keys, the literal ones, and it felt like a strange kind of leverage. They asked about my plans for the property. Were they looking to sell it? Would I consider turning it over to the HOA, or at least allow them to manage it? I could tell they were fishing for a way to regain control, even if they couldn't outright block my access. Their questions weren't about compromise, they were about reconsolidating their influence. I was straightforward with them. I told them I had no interest in selling or relinquishing anything. This wasn't about making money off the land, it was about ensuring that the promises made to homeowners were respected. I wasn't going to let the HOA change the rules just because they felt like it. This wasn't a game. It was about the community, about what we all were promised when we bought our homes. The conversation went on for a while, with a lot of back and forth. They tried to convince me that maintaining the gate was for safety. They brought up concerns about insurance, about keeping the lake access limited to approved individuals. They even mentioned the idea of putting up a second fence, this time around the gate itself, to ensure that unauthorized people didn't enter. But I saw through it all. This wasn't about safety. It was about control. They didn't want anyone stepping outside their carefully structured rules. But I wasn't going to play along with their game. I made it clear that if they were serious about ensuring fair access, we could come to an agreement, but it had to respect everyone's rights. No more obstacles. No more hidden agendas. The more we talked, the more it became clear that they didn't have a solid plan. They'd built this fence as a way to exercise power, but they hadn't thought through the logistics or the legal consequences. Now, they were scrambling to save face. They kept bringing up ideas for new regulations, new management plans, but it was all a bit too late. The truth was, they had already lost the upper hand. That's when the real shift happened. Instead of trying to negotiate for more control, they began asking what I would be willing to agree on. What kind of access could be provided to the community? What would be a fair system for everyone who had the same legal right to the lake? I realized then that they were no longer in charge of the conversation. The tables had turned. I didn't just have the legal right to the lake anymore. I had the power to decide how it would be shared. And that was exactly what I had wanted from the beginning. It wasn't just about having access for myself. It was about making sure the access was available to all the homeowners who had been treated unfairly. By the end of the meeting, we had agreed on a much more open and fair system. The HOA would manage the path, but they couldn't block anyone's access without consent. They'd provide a set of keys to homeowners who had deeded rights, and the gate would remain open, as it should have been all along. There was no applause, no grand celebration. But as I walked out of that meeting, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The whole thing had started with a fence, an obstruction, a violation of rights. But it ended with a fair compromise, one that respected the community and restored access to the lake for everyone. The HOA might have thought they were untouchable. They might have believed their rules were ironclad. But they hadn't counted on one thing. Sometimes, standing up for your rights isn't about making a big scene. Sometimes, it's about quietly owning the gate, holding the keys, and being patient enough to let the right solution reveal itself. After the meeting, things didn't immediately go back to normal. The neighbors who had been following the situation were watching closely. They were curious about what would happen next, what I would do with the power I now had. Some were just relieved to know that there would be no more obstacles to their access. Others were skeptical, wondering if the HOA would find a way to change things again. But for the first time, it felt like we were on equal footing with the HOA. They no longer held all the cards, and I didn't have to keep fighting to prove that my rights mattered. I took my time after the meeting, not rushing into anything. I knew I had the freedom to decide how to manage the access, but I wasn't interested in running the neighborhood. I wasn't interested in being the gatekeeper, in any dramatic sense. I just wanted to make sure that the same issues never came up again, that no one else would have to go through what I had. At first, things felt calm. The gate stayed open for everyone who had legitimate access rights. People started using it again, walking down to the lake, and enjoying the views. The HOA didn't challenge it, they stuck to the new system we had agreed on. There was no drama. The quiet satisfaction of having resolved it on my own terms was enough. Then one weekend, something unexpected happened. A neighbor stopped by, the first time someone had approached me directly about the situation. It wasn't someone I knew very well, just a couple who had been living in the neighborhood for a few years. They thanked me for standing up to the HOA, for taking control of the situation. "You don't know how many of us have been fighting this for years," they said. "We just didn't know how to handle it." They went on to explain that they'd been writing letters to the HOA for months, even years, trying to get something done about the fence, but nothing ever came of it. They'd felt powerless, unheard, like their concerns didn't matter. They were relieved to see that someone had finally taken action. That conversation stuck with me. It wasn't just about the gate anymore. It was about the ripple effect. I had become a symbol, not just of taking control of a piece of land, but of standing up against an overreaching authority. The neighbors who had once been silent now felt like they had someone who understood, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge what seemed wrong. Over the next few months, more people started reaching out to me. Some shared their frustration with the HOA about the rules that seemed unfair or overly restrictive. Others expressed their gratitude that someone had fought back against the fence, seeing how it had benefited the entire neighborhood. The idea that one person could shift the power dynamics and create change in a community started to sink in. But there was still work to be done. The HOA didn't just disappear after our meeting, and they still had influence in other areas of the neighborhood. People still had concerns. And while the access issue was resolved, I realized there were bigger questions to address, especially when it came to how the HOA managed the neighborhood's common areas. People were starting to think about other ways the HOA might be mismanaging things, but they didn't know where to begin. One afternoon, a small group of neighbors came over to talk. They had an idea. They wanted to form a committee, not to overthrow the HOA but to ensure there was transparency, to make sure their voices were heard. It wasn't about creating conflict, it was about fairness. They wanted a way to be involved, to understand the decisions that were being made, and to make sure they had a say in what happened next. I was surprised but also inspired. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about getting a gate open or having access to the lake. It was about taking the power back and using it in a way that benefited everyone. The more we talked, the more I realized that the entire neighborhood had been waiting for something to change. They were waiting for someone to take the first step, to challenge the status quo. It wasn't just about owning a piece of land anymore. It was about giving people the courage to speak up, to work together, to hold the HOA accountable. We weren't trying to tear down the system. We were trying to make it work for everyone. By the time the summer ended, there was a sense of unity in the neighborhood. People who had once felt alienated, ignored, or helpless now felt empowered. They saw that standing up for what was right didn't require grand gestures or long, expensive lawsuits. Sometimes, it just meant taking control of your own little piece of the world, and letting everyone else know they could do the same. And all of it started with a gate. A simple metal barrier that was supposed to keep me away from something I had the right to access. But in the end, it became a turning point. Not just for me, but for an entire community that had been waiting for a reason to come together and make their voices heard. A few months passed, and life in the neighborhood started to feel different. The lake access issue was no longer a point of contention. It was settled, and everyone knew it. But there was something else brewing under the surface. A quiet shift in how people viewed the HOA, how they viewed their community, and maybe even how they viewed themselves. It wasn't just about one person standing up anymore. It wasn't just about a single act of defiance that opened the gate. The ripple effect had created a change in mindset. People had been living under this unspoken belief that the HOA's rules were absolute, that they had to accept things as they were handed to them. But now they were starting to realize that wasn't necessarily true. That was the real power, the realization that the community, together, could question things. They could challenge things. They could ask for more. One evening, a neighbor I'd never spoken to before came by my house. He introduced himself, said he lived a few streets over, and thanked me for standing up to the HOA. He told me that, like many others, he had always felt like the HOA's decisions were untouchable. But after what happened with the gate, he started to question everything. He said, "I didn't think it was possible to change anything until you did what you did." He wasn't the first one to say something like that. Over the weeks, I heard the same sentiment from more and more people. Some who lived in the neighborhood for years, others who had only recently moved in. They all had one thing in common: a feeling of powerlessness, of being pushed around by the HOA and its rules. And now, they were waking up. They were starting to think, if one person can challenge this, why can't we all? It was a strange feeling, knowing that my actions had inspired something bigger than I could have imagined. But I wasn't alone in this. Slowly, a group of neighbors began to form, people who wanted to see some changes, who wanted to have more input. They weren't angry or radical. They didn't want to start a revolution. But they wanted fairness. They wanted accountability. And they wanted the power to make their voices heard. We started having meetings, small gatherings in people's homes, talking about issues that affected everyone. Some big, some small. We discussed the HOA's budget, how the dues were being spent, why certain decisions seemed to favor a few and ignore the rest. These weren't dramatic confrontations, just regular folks sitting around, drinking coffee, and talking about what mattered to them. It was a simple idea. Why not have a voice in how things are run? Why not be part of the conversation? The more we met, the more we realized there were so many areas where the HOA wasn't doing its job. From the way common areas were maintained to the restrictions on pet ownership, there were complaints everywhere. But they weren't the kind of complaints that sparked anger. They were the kind that made you think, this could be better. It should be better. So we started putting together a list of concerns, things we thought the HOA should address. It wasn't about attacking anyone personally. It was about improving things for the whole community. We realized that if we wanted to have a voice, we needed to be organized. We needed to present a united front, not just a scattered group of people complaining. A few neighbors and I went to the next HOA meeting, not with anger or demands, but with a proposal. We didn't show up to fight. We showed up to talk. We presented our ideas for a more transparent HOA, with better communication and a clearer process for addressing concerns. We suggested that meetings be more open, that people be encouraged to ask questions and participate. We even proposed forming a community advisory group, a non-binding group that would meet with the HOA board to discuss issues before decisions were made. We were looking for dialogue, not confrontation. The meeting was tense at first. The HOA board members weren't used to this kind of engagement. But we kept it respectful. We kept it focused. We didn't demand anything unreasonable. We simply asked for a chance to be heard, a chance to be involved in decisions that affected all of us. And something incredible happened. Slowly, the tone of the meeting shifted. The board members started to listen. They started to take our concerns seriously. They didn't agree with everything we suggested, but they didn't dismiss us either. For the first time, it felt like a real conversation was happening, a conversation that included everyone, not just the people at the top who made all the decisions behind closed doors. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a shift, a sign that things could change, that the power dynamics in the neighborhood didn't have to stay the same. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger, a movement that could affect how the HOA operated and how the community as a whole interacted with it. The whole point wasn't to overthrow the HOA. It was to make sure it worked for everyone, that it respected the rights of every homeowner, and that the people who lived there had a say in the decisions that shaped their lives. That simple act of buying a small piece of land, of taking control of the gate, had done more than just open a path to the lake. It had opened a path for the entire neighborhood to begin speaking up and working together. It was a reminder that, sometimes, the smallest actions can create the biggest change.